Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So if this sounds like what you need, then make sure that you hit the subscribe button below. So in today's video, we're looking at one of the more unsavory, unlikable characters in American fiction, Tom Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. For those of you who have read the novel, you know that Tom is the well-endowed, old money millionaire husband of Daisy, who is Jay Gatsby's love interest. So Tom is a serial philanderer, violent abuser of women, shameless racist, and an arrogant WASP, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, who thinks that anyone outside his socioeconomic milieu is inferior. So it's pretty fair to say that there's really nothing much to like about this character. However, instead of boxing him in as this antagonist or villain archetype, I suggest that we consider the characterization of Tom Buchanan in a more sympathetic, humanizing light. We may not like Tom for all his obvious moral flaws, but is it possible to pity or feel bad for him? And if so, how does the author make it possible for us to respond to such a supposedly distasteful character with sympathy and pathos? Most importantly, taking such a nuanced approach to character analysis is going to put you solidly in the top grade lit student category. So if that is what you're after, then make sure that you watch till the very end for a top grade interpretation. So right from the start of the novel, we know that Tom Buchanan is an unpleasant character. From his cruel body, arrogant eyes, supercilious manner, and compulsive cheating, Tom Buchanan is positioned very much as this foil to Jay Gatsby, who is charming, convivial, and singularly devoted to one woman and one woman only, who is of course Daisy Buchanan, Tom's wife and Gatsby's one-time lover. So as the narrator Nick Carraway tells us, Nick himself and Tom were classmates back at Yale. When the latter was already an unpopular presence, there were men at New Haven who hated his guts. The author gives us plenty of other reasons to dislike Tom as we carry on reading the novel, such as his open racism, as when he comments, "Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and next, they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriages between black and white," which is a statement that Nick disdainfully calls Tom's impassioned gibberish. Tom also has no qualms whatsoever about abusing women. We know that he emotionally abuses Daisy on the regular by cheating on her openly, but also when he hits his mistress Myrtle after she spites him by mentioning Daisy's name. Perhaps because Tom cannot bear the shame of being reminded of wronging his wife by, out of all people, his own mistress. But apart from these more apparent markers of a dislikable personality, there is in fact something darker about Tom which makes him a menacing figure. And we can see this from a symbolic moment in chapter 1, when Nick visits the Buchanans for dinner at their East Egg house, and Tom comes into the drawing room. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of the picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows and the court wind died out around the room and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. Compared to the two young women's vivacity and lightness, as symbolized by the airy motifs of an anchored balloon and their rippling and fluttering white dresses, Tom's entrance is deadening, heavy, and almost a touch morbid, as the court wind died out about the room and the curtains and the rugs upon him entering to shut the rear windows. So the foreboding is very clear here. Tom is someone who carries a miasma of death about him, and those who attach themselves to him are likely to end up in tragic, if not lethal, circumstances. And this, of course, is exactly what happens with Daisy's perennial misery and emotional deadness as his long-suffering wife, and ultimately with his mistress Myrtle's death by car crash at the end of the novel. Arrogant, abusive, and all-around bad vibes. So, what is there really about such a character for us to sympathise with, Jen? Now, if we examine the overall narrative structure, we'll see that Tom's characterization actually takes on more complexity and nuance as the plot develops. Any character with depth would embody some degree of contradiction, which is, of course, also what makes them so fascinating to study. And in E.M. Forster's taxonomy, these will be what we call round, as opposed to flat characters. For instance, Jay Gatsby owns a lavish mansion and becomes tremendously wealthy, and yet he has little interest in personally enjoying the fruit of his wealth. And actually, in my previous video on whether or not Gatsby is after the American dream, I go into a bit deeper about why that might be the case. So check that out here if you haven't watched that already. Daisy is disgusted by her husband's infidelity, and yet she has no wish to leave Tom despite the emotional abuse that he continually subjects her to. And even Nick, the narrator, who knows early on that Gatsby isn't an entirely honest figure, comes to develop a sense of loyal affection towards Gatsby. So you see that all of these characters that are important in the novel are all quite contradictory in some way. So with Tom, he cheats on Daisy openly and regularly, and yet in a perverse but no less genuine way, he also actually loves her. Some of us may argue that, well, he just wants to keep Daisy around as a trophy wife for social signalling. But there are, in fact, moments in the novel when we see Tom's true affections for Daisy come through. For example, in chapter 7, when Gatsby and Tom confront each other about Daisy's allegiance, and Tom reminds Daisy of that time when they had a honeymoon in Hawaii. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. I never loved him, Daisy said, with perceptible reluctance. Not at Capulani? Demanded Tom suddenly. No. From the ballroom beneath, muffled and suffocating chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. Not that day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? There was a husky tenderness in Tom's tone. Daisy? Now, while the husky tenderness in Tom's tone shows him in this emotionally vulnerable state as he fears the thought of his wife leaving him forever, the symbolism of the muffled and suffocating chords here suggests that something is constantly left unsaid within this troubled marriage, as the auditory diction of muffled and suffocating hints that barriers in verbal and emotional communication exist between husband and wife. And it is only now, with the trigger of an external threat, i.e. Jay Gatsby, that these fundamental communication problems in their marriage are finally starting to bubble up to the surface, drifting up on hot waves of air, which encapsulate that heated energy and discontent in the atmosphere of the scene. But the fact that Tom demonstrates some degree of nostalgic melancholy shows that he at least cares enough about protecting his marriage with Daisy, regardless of his habitual misbehaviour towards her, which she also arguably lets him get away with time and again. Towards the end of the novel, there's another moment that casts Tom in a vulnerable, pitiable light, which is when Nick bumps into him on Fifth Avenue sometime after the tragic events of Myrtle and Gatsby's deaths. Convinced that Tom was responsible for Gatsby's death by telling Myrtle's husband, George Wilson, that it was Gatsby driving the yellow car which had hit Myrtle, Nick's immediate reaction to his erstwhile classmate is disdain. But his stance quickly softens once he realizes that Tom is, in his own way, suffering his unique brand of tragedy, which is comprised of willful ignorance, pompous self-righteousness, and incurable arrogance. What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me? Yes, you know what I think of you. You're crazy, Nick, he said quickly. Crazy as hell. I don't know what's the matter with you. Tom, I inquired, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? He stared at me without a word, and I knew I had guessed right about those missing hours. I started to turn away, but he took a step after me and grabbed my arm. I told him the truth, he said. He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave, and when I sent down word that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car. His hand was on a revolver in his pocket every minute he was in the house. He broke off defiantly. What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust into your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. There was nothing I could say except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. Now, before we move on, this is a great moment of dramatic irony because we, just as Nick, know that it was in fact Daisy, not Gatsby, who had been driving the fateful car which caused Myrtle's death. But Tom doesn't know this, and Nick has enough empathy not to let on what had really happened that night. And so to remain in this ignorant state, and worse, to have others believe that you are actually better off remaining in ignorance, is perhaps also one of the key tragic markers of Tom Buchanan. He's just not worth the intellectual or moral effort, as Tom continues with his self-defense. And if you think I didn't have my share of suffering, look here, when I went to give up that flat and saw that damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. My God, it was awful. So the dog biscuits here allude to the Airedale Terrier that Tom had bought Myrtle, and Tom's confession of having sat down and cried like a baby almost seems to reduce him to this pathetic image of a helpless puppy. So while it may be tempting to dismiss his comment on having my share of suffering as a self-pitying posture, perhaps it would be more rewarding for our analysis to consider what Tom's suffering may actually be. Is it feeling trapped by the old money associations and social expectations that he feels compelled to live up to? Is it feeling a sense of disorientation in a world where novel-reach people like Jay Gatsby could rival his wealth? And is his arrogance a facade to hide a deeper sense of insecurity, one which stems from knowing that whatever he does in life, his efforts will always be discounted as being a beneficiary of privileged birth? Or, as counterintuitive as it may sound, does he suffer for living too privileged and comfortable a life, which in turn leaves him driftless and uninspired, driving him to seek out the thrill of philandering, despite knowing deep down that this only compounds his guilt and makes him feel all the worse about himself. And so as Nick begins to see Tom's suffering through Tom's eyes, his attitude softens from the initial disdain to a kind of clear-eyed fellow feeling. I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw that what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. Now, once again, this image of a child is evoked to remind us that Tom, for all his bluster, pomposity, and moral failings, is at his core a weakling, a helpless child who's just as lost for direction and purpose as his nemesis, Jay Gatsby. He may get to keep Daisy as his wife and continue to cheat on her with no repercussions whatsoever, and continue to live on in material comfort. But he must always suffer for the spiritual hollowness that he carries within, and seek the dangerous, reckless outlet of smashing up things and creatures, of letting other people clean up the mess that he made, before pathetically retreating back into his money or vast carelessness and whatever it was that kept him and Daisy together. The nonchalant throwaway tone of the phrase, whatever it was, also reflects a sense of not caring and suggests that Nick has resigned himself fully to the fact that people like Tom and Daisy will just never change, and that ultimately this inability to change and progress is what makes them such sad, sad characters who deserve the pity of more enlightened souls like you. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope you found my character analysis of Tom Buchanan useful and that it gave you some new ideas to start coming up with your own take on Tom Buchanan and potentially the rest of the crew in The Great Gatsby. Make sure that you check out my other Gatsby below in the description box if you haven't already, which are definitely going to help you with your studies of the novel. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, so that you never miss out on any of my weekly study videos to help you get top grades in the subject. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!